On the morning of April the 14th, 1814, Eleanor Ashworth woke to the sound of her youngest sister's laughter drifting up through the floorboards of their modest townhouse, a rented property situated on the unfashionable eastern edge of Mayfair, where the streets grew narrower and the addresses less impressive. She lay still for a moment beneath the thin coverlet, watching the pale grey light of an overcast spring morning filter through curtains that had been mended twice at the seams, and she allowed herself precisely 10 heartbeats to feel the familiar weight of her circumstances before rising to face another day. At 26 years of age, Eleanor had long since accepted that her season of possibilities had passed, carried away on the tide of time and family obligation. Like so many dreams, she had learned to fold carefully and store in the quiet chambers of her heart. She had been 18 when their father's investments failed. 19 when she had refused her one serious suitor because accepting him would have meant abandoning her mother and sisters to navigate their reduced circumstances alone, and every year since had added another layer of invisibility to her person until she moved through ballrooms and drawing rooms like a ghost that society had collectively agreed not to see. The face that greeted her in the small mirror above her washstand was pleasant enough, she supposed, with brown eyes that her father had once called thoughtful, and features that arranged themselves in harmonious if unremarkable configuration, but it was not a face that launched ships or inspired poetry or caught the attention of eligible gentlemen scanning crowded rooms for beauty and fortune. She dressed herself in a modest blue morning gown, its fabric soft from many washings, and descended to find the household already humming with excitement about the evening's event, the Harcourt Ball, which would serve as Lydia's true debut into society, despite the 3 weeks they had already spent in London making careful appearances and strategic introductions. Her mother stood at the breakfast table sorting through correspondence with anxious fingers, while Lydia twirled between the furniture practicing dance steps and chattering about which gentleman might ask her to dance, and whether the Duke of Thornbury would truly attend as the gossip columns suggested. Eleanor poured herself tea and listened to her sister's breathless speculation about the mysterious Duke who was said to be seeking a bride this season. A man of immense fortune and ancient title, whose cold demeanour and exacting standards had sent a dozen hopeful young ladies fleeing in tears over the years. She did not allow herself to imagine such a man ever glancing her direction, for Eleanor Ashworth had learned that hope was a luxury she could not afford, and so she simply smiled at Lydia's enthusiasm and silently calculated whether they could manage new ribbons for her sister's dancing slippers, while she herself prepared for another evening of standing near walls and watching others live the life she had once been foolish enough to want for herself. The modiste shop on Bond Street hummed with activity when Eleanor and Lydia arrived at 11 o'clock that same morning, the cramped space filled with bolts of silk and muslin in every shade imaginable, while seamstresses darted between fitting rooms, carrying pins and ribbons, and the dreams of a dozen young ladies preparing for the season's most anticipated events. Eleanor stood quietly near the window, while Madame Fournier herself attended to Lydia, the Frenchwoman's nimble fingers adjusting the fall of white silk that would transform her youngest sister into a vision of debutante perfection, and she tried not to notice how the seamstress's eyes had passed over her own figure with barely concealed disinterest when they entered. Her own gown for the evening hung in the back room, awaiting minor alterations, a deep green velvet dress that had belonged to her 2 seasons ago, and had been carefully re-trimmed with subtle gold threading along the bodice to give it the appearance of something new, though anyone with a discerning eye would recognize the cut as distinctly outdated. She was examining a display of ribbons she could not afford when the distinctive sharp laugh of Lady Catherine Greville cut through the shop's pleasant bustle, and Eleanor felt her shoulders tighten instinctively as the woman's carrying voice reached her from behind a nearby curtain, where she was apparently being fitted for something magnificent. "I saw the Ashworth girls arrive," Lady Catherine was saying to her companion, with the casual cruelty of those who never consider that walls have ears and curtains are thin. "The younger one is pretty enough, I suppose, though without fortune or connections she will need every advantage that face can provide. But the elder? Well, it is rather tragic, is it not? Dragging a spinster sister along season after season like some faded piece of furniture one cannot bring oneself to discard." Eleanor's fingers stilled on the green ribbon she had been touching, and she focused very carefully on keeping her expression neutral as the voice continued, her practiced composure the only armor she possessed against such casual devastation. "I hear Lord Montague has expressed interest in making the acquaintance of Miss Lydia Ashworth," Lady Catherine's companion replied, and Eleanor filed away that name, that first mention of the Earl of Westbrook, who would later feature so prominently in her story, though she could not know it then. Lydia emerged from the fitting room in a cloud of white silk and breathless excitement, and Eleanor smiled at her sister with genuine warmth that cost her more than anyone would ever know, complimenting the gown and adjusting a fold of fabric, while Madame Fournier brought out Eleanor's green velvet and held it against her with an expression that suggested she was performing an act of charity rather than commerce. The gold threading caught the light from the window as Eleanor touched the familiar fabric, and she thought of her grandmother's small pearl earrings that she would wear tonight, the only jewelry she possessed that held any value, and she told herself firmly that the gown was perfectly adequate for a woman who expected nothing more than to fade into the wallpaper while her beautiful sister danced. The drawing room of the Ashworth townhouse had never been a grand space, but on that April afternoon it seemed to shrink further still as Eleanor sat beside the window with her needlework lying forgotten in her lap, watching the street below where carriages passed carrying ladies to their afternoon calls while she waited for nothing and no one in particular. Her mother had retreated to her bedroom to rest before the evening's exertions, having spent the morning delivering an exhaustive lecture to Lydia about proper behavior at balls and the critical importance of securing at least 2 dances with gentlemen of consequence, and Eleanor had noticed with the quiet ache of long familiarity that not a single word of advice had been directed her way, as though her mother had already written the final chapter of her eldest daughter's romantic prospects and found no reason to revise the ending. The clock on the mantel had just struck 2 when the sound of carriage wheels stopping before their door brought Eleanor's attention to the window, and her heart lifted at the sight of Lady Harriet Sinclair descending from her elegant barouche, the wealthy widow whose friendship had been one of the few genuine blessings of Eleanor's circumscribed life since they had met 3 years ago at a country assembly where Harriet had declared herself charmed by Eleanor's wit and appalled by society's blindness. Harriet swept into the drawing-room moments later, trailing the familiar scent of lavender that always accompanied her, and in her hands she carried a small basket that Eleanor knew from experience would contain the lemon biscuits from Gunther's that were Eleanor's secret weakness, a kindness so characteristic of Harriet that it made Eleanor's throat tighten with gratitude. "I have come to ensure you are not planning to hide in corners all evening," Harriet announced as she settled onto the settee and began unpacking her basket, "for I have it on excellent authority that the Duke of Thornbury will be attending the Harcourt ball tonight, and I am determined that you shall have at least one conversation worth remembering." Eleanor accepted a biscuit and shook her head with the patient resignation of someone who had long ago learned not to indulge in impossible dreams, telling Harriet that dukes did not notice women like her, women of 26 with modest faces and empty dowries who had already been passed over by every eligible gentleman in 3 counties. But Harriet would not be deterred, describing Frederick Ravenscroft in terms that painted him as both fascinating and tragic, a man of 32 years whose cold exterior concealed wounds inflicted by a former fiancé who had used his heart as a stepping stone to his rival's brother, a man who had built walls so high that society had concluded he must be made of ice rather than flesh. "He needs someone real," Harriet insisted, "someone who would see past titles and fortunes to the man beneath." And Eleanor felt a strange flutter in her chest that she immediately suppressed, for she knew better than anyone that fairy tales were for young girls with futures still unwritten, not for spinster sisters whose only role tonight would be standing in shadows while Lydia danced in light. Harcourt House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles when Harriet's carriage deposited the Ashworth family at the entrance that evening at 7 o'clock, and Eleanor felt her breath catch, despite herself, as she stepped through the grand doorway into a world that seemed conjured from the pages of a fairy story she had long ago stopped believing in, the marble floors gleaming beneath crystal chandeliers that scattered rainbows across silk gowns and military uniforms, while an orchestra played somewhere in the distance, and the mingled scents of hothouse flowers and French perfume created an intoxicating atmosphere that made her heart ache with a longing she could not quite name. Through the tall windows that lined the eastern wall, she could see the famous Harcourt rose gardens, illuminated by strategically placed lanterns, the blooms not yet fully opened in the cool April air, but promising beauty that would rival even the splendor within, and she found herself drawn toward that view as Lydia was immediately swept away by their mother toward a cluster of eligible young men, while Eleanor drifted through the crowd like a leaf carried on a gentle current, noticed by no one, belonging nowhere, finding her accustomed place near the refreshment table where wallflowers gathered to pretend they preferred conversation to dancing. The green velvet of her gown caught the candlelight as she moved, the gold threading glinting with each step, and for one brief moment she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be one of those glittering creatures who commanded attention simply by existing, those fortunate women whose dance cards filled within moments of their arrival and whose futures stretched before them like sunlit paths rather than narrowing corridors. She was watching a young couple take their places for a quadrille when her gaze drifted across the ballroom and landed upon a man standing apart from the crowd near the far pillar, his dark evening coat impeccably cut and his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to being observed rather than observing, and something about the intensity of his expression as he surveyed the room made Eleanor's pulse quicken in a way she immediately dismissed as foolish fancy unworthy of a woman who had learned better than to dream. She did not know him, could not from this distance make out his features clearly, but there was a stillness about him that spoke of carefully controlled power, and something else beneath it, something that looked almost like the same loneliness she saw each morning in her own mirror, though surely that was merely her imagination projecting meaning onto a stranger who would never spare her a second glance. She was still watching him, forgetting herself in that moment of inexplicable fascination, when she became aware of another presence nearby, and turned to find a gentleman with golden hair and a practiced smile studying her with an interest that felt calculated rather than genuine, his handsome features arranged in an expression of charming curiosity as he introduced himself as Lord Victor Montague, Earl of Westbrook, and asked if she might tell him what had so captured her attention across the room. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Eleanor had managed to extract herself from Lord Montague's attentions with a murmured excuse about seeking refreshment, though in truth his proximity had left her feeling unsettled in ways she could not quite articulate, and she had just positioned herself beside a marble column where she might observe the dancers without being observed in return when she became aware of someone approaching from her left, and she turned expecting perhaps a servant or another wallflower seeking refuge, only to find herself face to face with the very man she had been watching across the ballroom, the one whose stillness had called to something deep within her, and up close he was even more striking than she had imagined, his features sharp and aristocratic beneath dark hair that showed the slightest wave, his eyes the color of a winter storm as they fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "I believe you are standing before the Caravaggio," he said without preamble, his voice low and rich and carrying a hint of something she might have called amusement if his expression had not remained so carefully neutral, and Eleanor blinked in confusion before realizing he was gesturing to the painting mounted on the wall just behind her left shoulder, a dramatic rendering of Judith with the head of Holofernes that she had not even noticed in her distraction. "I confess I was not attending to it," she replied before she could think better of speaking so plainly to a stranger, though perhaps I should be grateful for the reminder that even the most powerful men are vulnerable to determined women with sharp implements. The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile quickly suppressed, and he tilted his head as though seeing her for the first time, despite having initiated the conversation, asking if she always offered such bloodthirsty commentary on artwork at balls, or if this was a special occasion. "Only when the artwork merits it," Eleanor heard herself say, wondering at her own boldness, even as some reckless part of her refused to retreat into the safety of simpering agreement. And she found herself noting the heavy signet ring on his right hand, the impeccable cut of his dark evening coat, the way he held himself like a man accustomed to commanding attention, yet seemed almost surprised to be enjoying this exchange. They spoke then of the other paintings visible along the gallery wall, and Eleanor forgot entirely to be self-conscious as she offered observations about brushwork and composition that drew from years of study in her father's modest library. And the stranger listened with an attention that felt nothing like the polite tolerance she had grown accustomed to receiving from gentlemen who would rather be anywhere else, his questions sharp and probing in ways that suggested genuine curiosity rather than mere conversation. She was in the middle of explaining why she believed the small landscape in the corner to be incorrectly attributed when a portly gentleman in military regalia appeared at the stranger's elbow with an air of barely concealed impatience, murmuring something about the Duchess of Pemberton requiring his presence, and the stranger's expression flickered with what looked remarkably like irritation before he schooled his features back to neutrality. "Forgive me," he said to Eleanor, and there was something in his tone that suggested the apology was genuine rather than perfunctory. "I find I must attend to duty, but I would know your name before I go." She opened her mouth to answer, but the military gentleman was already steering him away through the crowd, and Eleanor was left standing alone beside the Caravaggio, with her heart racing and a question forming on her lips that would remain unspoken until she could discover who exactly had just looked at her as though she were the most interesting person in the room. The stranger had been gone for perhaps 10 minutes, when Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe properly, her mind spinning with the fragments of their conversation as she tried to convince herself that the encounter had been nothing more than a brief curiosity for a bored gentleman, and that she would be foolish indeed to read anything more into his attention. Yet she could not quite suppress the warmth that lingered in her chest, or the way her pulse still fluttered when she remembered how he had looked at her, as though her words actually mattered to him, as though she were someone worth listening to, rather than merely a piece of furniture positioned conveniently near an interesting painting. She was still standing beside the Caravaggio, reluctant to move from the spot where something unexpected had happened to her, when she became aware of voices nearby, and she recognized with a sinking feeling the distinctive laugh of Lady Catherine Greville, holding court with her usual circle of gossips just beyond the column that had been providing Eleanor such comfortable anonymity throughout the evening. "Did you see him speaking to the elder Ashworth girl?" Lady Catherine was saying, in that carrying tone she employed when she wished to wound without appearing to aim. The poor creature was practically trembling with hope, as though the Duke of Thornbury would ever seriously consider someone so far beneath his notice, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the words registered and rearranged themselves into meaning. The Duke of Thornbury, the stranger with the storm-grey eyes and the heavy signet ring and the attention that had felt so impossibly genuine, was Frederick Ravenscroft himself, the most sought-after bachelor in England, and she had stood there speaking to him about artwork and brushwork as though they were equals, as though she had any right to hold his interest for even a moment. One can only assume he mistook her for someone else at first, and was too polite to extract himself immediately. Another voice added with poisonous sweetness, though I dare say even his famous coldness has its limits when confronted with such obvious presumption above one's station, and Eleanor pressed herself further into the shadow of the column, willing herself invisible, feeling the mortification rise in her throat like bile, even as some stubborn part of her whispered that he had not seemed bored, had not seemed eager to escape, had asked her name before being pulled away, and had apologized as though he meant it. She was still wrestling with this impossible contradiction when Lord Montague appeared beside her once more, his golden hair gleaming in the candlelight, and his practiced smile firmly in place as he handed her a glass of champagne she had not requested, and observed that she seemed to have made quite an impression on the Duke, his tone light, but his eyes sharp with something that looked almost like calculation. "I see you have discovered his identity," Montague continued, when Eleanor could not find words to respond, "and I feel it only fair to warn you that Frederick Ravenscroft has a cold heart beneath that handsome exterior. a coldness that has wounded more than one hopeful young lady who mistook his passing curiosity for genuine interest. And Eleanor heard the bitterness beneath his charm, the old hatred dressed up as friendly concern. And though she did not know this man well enough to understand the source of his enmity toward the Duke, something in her instinctively distrusted the warning, even as her grandmother's pearl earrings caught the light, and Lady Catherine's circle continued their whispered dissection of her foolish hopes just beyond the marble column. Eleanor had escaped to the terrace because the weight of too many eyes had become unbearable, the whispers following her like a persistent draught through the ballroom as she slipped between the French doors and into the cool April night where the famous Harcourt rose gardens stretched before her in silvered shadows beneath a moon that hung nearly full above the hedgerows. And she stood at the stone balustrade, breathing deeply of air that carried the first green promise of spring blooms not yet opened, trying to quiet the tumult in her chest that had not ceased since she learned she had been speaking to the Duke of Thornbury as though he were merely a man and not the most powerful eligible bachelor in England, and she was so lost in her own mortification and confusion that she did not hear the footsteps behind her until a familiar voice said, "I believe you owe me a name," and she turned to find Frederick Ravenscroft standing in the doorway, the candlelight from the ballroom gilding his shoulders while his face remained in shadow, and Eleanor felt her heart perform a complicated maneuver that left her slightly breathless as she considered fleeing back inside, only to realize that would require passing directly by him, and she was not at all certain her composure would survive such proximity. "I understand now why you seemed so amused by our conversation," she said instead, choosing dignity over retreat. "You might have mentioned you were the Duke everyone has been whispering about all evening, and spoil the only honest conversation I have had in months," he replied, stepping fully onto the terrace and allowing the door to close behind him with a soft click that felt somehow significant. "I found your ignorance of my title rather refreshing, Miss Ashworth. Yes, I have since learned your name, and I confess I am curious whether knowing mine will change the way you speak to me." Eleanor considered this question seriously as he came to stand beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she could see the way the moonlight caught the planes of his face and turned his storm-grey eyes to silver. And she found herself saying that she supposed it depended on whether he wished to be spoken to as a duke or as a man who appreciated honest opinions about Caravaggio. Something shifted in his expression then, something that looked almost like pain quickly masked, and he said quietly that he had learned to expect the former from everyone, that the title preceded him into every room and every conversation until he sometimes wondered if the man beneath it had ceased to exist entirely. Eleanor felt the ache behind his words as clearly as if he had shouted it, and she said simply that she thought it must be very lonely to be seen only as a position rather than a person. And when he turned to look at her, there was something raw in his gaze that made her shiver, despite the relative mildness of the night. And he made an aborted movement as though to offer his coat before stopping himself and asking instead if he might call upon her tomorrow. And Eleanor heard herself agreeing before her mind could catalogue all the reasons this was impossible, watching his face transform with something that might have been relief as the rose garden perfumed the air around them and the music from the ballroom played on without them. The morning sun streamed through the drawing-room windows of the Ashworth townhouse with an almost aggressive cheerfulness that seemed to mock the nervous flutter in Eleanor's stomach as she sat in her soft yellow morning dress pretending to read a book of poetry, while her mind replayed every word Frederick had spoken on the moonlit terrace the night before, wondering if she had dreamed the entire encounter or if the Duke of Thornbury had truly asked permission to call upon her today, and she had nearly convinced herself that he would not come, that the light of morning would have revealed to him the foolishness of paying attention to a woman so far beneath his station, when the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones made her heart leap into her throat, and she looked up to see through the window a magnificent curricle drawn by perfectly matched grey horses pulling to a stop before their modest townhouse. Mrs. Ashworth dropped her embroidery hoop with a clatter that would have been comical under any other circumstances, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief and dawning comprehension and something that looked almost like fear as the butler announced, "His Grace the Duke of Thornbury, and Frederick entered the room looking impossibly handsome in a dark blue coat that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, and Eleanor watched her mother rise and sink into a curtsy so deep she feared the older woman might not recover from it, while Lydia hovered in the doorway with an expression of naked jealousy she was not quite managing to conceal. Frederick's eyes found Eleanor immediately, and she saw something flicker across his features that might have been relief, as though he too had spent the night wondering if their connection had been real or merely a trick of moonlight and champagne. And when he spoke, it was directly to her rather than to her mother, asking if she had slept well and whether the morning light had changed her opinion of their conversation about art and honesty and the burden of being seen only for what one represented rather than who one truly was. Mrs. Ashworth made a small strangled sound at this breach of protocol, clearly expecting the Duke to address her first and discuss the weather and perhaps inquire after Lydia's health. But Frederick seemed entirely unaware of or indifferent to the social niceties he was trampling as he asked Eleanor if she would do him the honor of driving with him in Hyde Park that afternoon at 5 o'clock. And Eleanor heard herself accepting before her mother could intervene, watching Frederick's storm-grey eyes warm with something that looked remarkably like genuine pleasure as he took his leave with promises to return at the appointed hour. The moment the door closed behind him, Mrs. Ashworth sank onto the settee and demanded to know what Eleanor had done to capture the attention of the most eligible bachelor in England, and Eleanor could only shake her head and say truthfully that she had no idea, that she had simply spoken to him as though he were a person rather than a title, and perhaps that had been enough. Hyde Park at 5 o'clock on an April afternoon was a theatre of society where everyone performed and everyone watched, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 curious eyes upon her as Frederick's magnificent curricle with its matched grey horses turned onto Rotten Row, and she sat beside the Duke of Thornbury in full view of the fashionable world that had never once looked at her before, her bonnet with its green ribbon that matched the gown from the ball now marking her as unmistakably present where she had always been invisible, and she kept her spine straight and her hands folded in her lap, even as she heard the whispers rising like a flock of startled birds from the carriages they passed, saw the opera glasses raised and the fans deployed to hide mouths that were certainly not saying kind things about the unremarkable Miss Ashworth, who had somehow captured the attention of the most sought-after bachelor in England. Frederick seemed to sense her discomfort, because his jaw tightened as they passed a barouche containing Lady Catherine Greville and her circle of gossips, and Eleanor distinctly heard the words above her station and temporary fancy and poor desperate creature before the curricle moved beyond earshot, and she felt her cheeks flame with humiliation even as she refused to let her expression betray her. And Frederick said in a low voice that carried only to her ears that Lady Catherine's tongue was as sharp as her mind was dull, and that Eleanor should pay her no more attention than one would pay a yapping lapdog. Eleanor surprised herself by laughing, a genuine sound that seemed to startle Frederick as much as it startled her. And she said that she had long practice in being invisible, and that being visible and criticized was simply a different form of the same dismissal she had always known, and something flickered in Frederick's storm-grey eyes that looked almost like admiration as he said quietly that she had more dignity than half the titled ladies in London and more wit than all of them combined, and Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest, even as she warned herself not to let such words mean too much. A rider on a magnificent black horse fell into pace beside them then, and Eleanor recognized Lord Montague's practised smile as he tipped his hat and said, "What a charming picture you make, Thornbury, playing shepherd to the tone's lost lambs," and the insult wrapped in pleasantry made Eleanor stiffen, but Frederick's response was glacial as he said that Montague would know nothing of charm or shepherding, being more accustomed to wolves and their methods, and the two men exchanged looks of such pure mutual hatred that Eleanor felt she had stumbled into a battlefield disguised as a park. Indeed, when Montague finally rode away with a smirk that promised future trouble, Frederick's hands on the reins had gone white-knuckled with suppressed fury, and Eleanor said nothing, but her heart had begun to understand that whatever existed between these men was far deeper and darker than mere social rivalry, and that she had somehow stepped into the middle of a war whose origins she did not yet comprehend. The bookshop on Bond Street smelled of leather and paper and possibility, scents that had always brought Eleanor comfort during the years when books had been her truest companions, and the worlds within their pages had offered escape from the constraints of her own limited existence. And now she stood among the towering shelves with Frederick beside her, and felt something shifting in her heart that she could not quite name, a cautious unfurling of hope that she had spent 3 days trying to suppress, even as he had called each morning and sent flowers each afternoon and looked at her with those storm-grey eyes as though she were something precious rather than something overlooked. The shop owner, Mr. Blackwood, had known Eleanor since she was a girl accompanying her father on his rare trips to London, and his eyebrows had climbed nearly to his receding hairline when she had entered on the arm of the Duke of Thornbury, but he had recovered quickly and retreated to give them privacy among the stacks, and now Eleanor ran her grey kid leather-gloved fingers along the spines of a shelf of poetry, while Frederick watched her with an expression she could not quite decipher. She paused at a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, the same edition her father had owned before it had been sold, along with most of their library, to pay debts, and she did not realize she had made a small sound of longing until Frederick reached for the book at the same moment she did, and his hand came down over hers, and neither of them moved for a long, breathless moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The touch burned through the thin leather of her glove, and Eleanor felt her breath catch as she looked up to find Frederick's face very close to hers, his eyes dark with something that looked almost like hunger, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, as he said that she should have this book, that he wished to give it to her, and Eleanor shook her head and said she could not accept such a gift, that it would not be proper. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a weak defense against the tide of feeling rising in her chest. Frederick did not release her hand as he said quietly that propriety had never brought him anything but loneliness, that he had spent years doing what was expected, and it had left him hollow, and Eleanor heard herself asking what had hollowed him, and watched his jaw tighten before he said only that he had trusted once and been made a fool, and she understood, without being told, that some woman had wounded him deeply, and that this wound was why he held himself so carefully apart from the world. The rain began then, pattering against the shop windows and trapping them together in this small sanctuary of books and dust motes and unspoken feeling, and Eleanor said softly that she too knew something of loneliness and of being found wanting, and Frederick's hand tightened over hers as he said that whoever had found her wanting was a blind fool, and when they finally left the shop an hour later, the volume of sonnets was wrapped in brown paper and tucked under Eleanor's arm, despite her protests. And she knew that she was falling into something from which there would be no graceful retreat. Lady Harriet Sinclair's music room glowed with the warm light of dozens of candles, their flames reflected in the polished surface of the grand piano, where a young woman played Beethoven with more enthusiasm than skill, and Eleanor sat beside Frederick on a small settee positioned near the window where the cool April evening air drifted in carrying the scent of Harriet's famous roses, and she was acutely aware of the whispers that had followed them since their arrival, the sidelong glances from the 30 or so guests who had gathered for this intimate evening of music and conversation, and she clutched the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets in her lap like a talisman because she had been reading from it when Frederick's carriage arrived and had not wanted to leave it behind, and Frederick's thigh was mere inches from hers on the narrow settee, and she could feel the heat of him even through the layers of her gown and his evening clothes. And when he leaned close to murmur that the pianist seemed determined to murder poor Beethoven, she had to press her lips together to suppress a laugh that would have drawn even more attention to them. The week since the Harcourt ball had passed in a dream from which Eleanor kept expecting to wake, 7 days of morning calls and afternoon drives and conversations that left her feeling seen in a way she had never experienced, and she had begun to trust that this impossible thing might actually be real, that the Duke of Thornbury might actually want her, plain spinster Eleanor Ashworth, with her modest dowry and her too-sharp tongue, and her family on the unfashionable edge of society. Frederick excused himself to fetch her refreshment, and Eleanor watched him cross the room, tall and commanding even in this intimate setting, and she did not notice Lord Montague approaching until his shadow fell across her, and his heavy cologne, something cloying and overly sweet that seemed designed to mask rather than compliment, invaded her senses and made her want to turn away. He sat without invitation in the space Frederick had vacated, and his smile was all practiced charm as he said he hoped she was enjoying her moment in the sun, and Eleanor felt ice form in her stomach at his tone, even before he continued, saying it was really quite clever of Thornbury to use her this way, and that Lady Arabella Forsyth must be positively green with jealousy, seeing Frederick pay such marked attention to another woman. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the book of sonnets as Montague explained with poisonous sweetness that Frederick had been engaged to Lady Arabella before she had thrown him over for Montague's own brother, and that clearly the Duke was using Eleanor to prove he had moved on, to make Arabella regret her choice. And surely Eleanor did not believe a man like Thornbury would actually marry so far beneath himself when he could have anyone. The words burrowed into Eleanor's chest like thorns, but she kept her expression composed as she said that Lord Montague's concern for her welfare was touching if unexpected, and something flickered in his eyes that looked like frustration at her refusal to crumble. And then Frederick was there, returned with 2 glasses of wine, and his gaze moved from Eleanor's too still face to Montague's smirk, and the temperature between the 2 men dropped to something arctic, as Frederick said quietly that Montague should find somewhere else to spread his particular brand of poison, and after Montague departed with a mocking bow, Eleanor could not quite meet Frederick's searching eyes, and when he asked what Montague had said, she replied only that it was nothing of consequence, but they both knew she was lying. The study at Ravenscroft House was a room designed to intimidate, all dark mahogany panelling and towering bookshelves, and the massive portrait of the late Duke hanging above the fireplace where painted eyes seemed to follow Frederick's every movement as he paced before the window, and Lord James Pembroke sat in one of the leather chairs watching his friend with growing concern, while the letter from the Dowager Duchess lay open on the desk like a coiled serpent waiting to strike, its elegant script containing words that had burrowed into Frederick's mind and awakened every doubt he had spent the past 11 days trying to silence. The Dowager had written from Bath, where she had retreated after the season proved too taxing for her constitution, but distance had not diminished her opinions nor softened her demands, and she had made clear that Frederick's attention to Miss Eleanor Ashworth was unsuitable, unacceptable, and would not be tolerated by any member of the Ravenscroft family who valued their position in society. Frederick turned his signet ring around his finger, a habit Pembroke recognized as a sign of profound agitation, and when he finally spoke his voice was rough, as he said that perhaps his aunt was right, that perhaps he had allowed himself to be carried away by something that could never end well, and Pembroke leaned forward and said firmly that this was madness, that he had watched Frederick come alive these past days in a way he had not seen since before Arabella's betrayal, and that Miss Ashworth was worth 10 of the simpering diamonds his aunt would have him pursue. But Frederick shook his head and said Pembroke did not understand, that Montague had been circling Eleanor at the musical, that the whispers were growing louder, that Eleanor would soon discover she had attached herself to a man whose heart had been so thoroughly broken he might never be capable of giving her what she deserved, and was it not kinder to end things now before she invested more of herself in someone so fundamentally damaged? Pembroke rose and crossed to his friend, and said that this was fear-talking, that Frederick was looking for reasons to retreat because feeling something real was more terrifying than feeling nothing at all, and Frederick's jaw tightened because the words struck too close to the truth, because every night he lay awake thinking of Eleanor's quiet laugh and her sharp wit and the way she looked at him as though she saw past the title to the man beneath, and the wanting was so acute it felt like a physical wound. He said he would test her, that he would withdraw for a few days and see if she pursued him for his position as Arabella had, and Pembroke said this was the worst possible plan, that Eleanor was not Arabella, that she would interpret his withdrawal as rejection and respond with the dignity that defined her, and Frederick would lose the best thing that had happened to him in years. But Frederick's eyes were fixed on his father's portrait, on the stern face of the man who had always demanded perfection, and he said quietly that he needed to be certain, that he could not survive being made a fool twice. And Pembroke left an hour later, knowing that his friend was about to make a terrible mistake, and powerless to stop him. The morning light of April 28th fell harsh and unforgiving through the drawing-room windows of the Ashworth townhouse, illuminating every worn thread in the carpet and every crack in the ceiling that the family could not afford to repair. And Eleanor sat in her simple grey dress, with her hands folded in her lap and the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets on the small table beside her, the book that Frederick had pressed into her hands at the bookshop on Bond Street when the rain had trapped them together and the world had seemed full of impossible promise. And she had been sitting thus for nearly an hour because the butler had announced the Duke of Thornbury, and something in the man's carefully neutral expression had told her that this visit would not be like the others. And when Frederick entered the room, he did not smile, did not cross to take her hand, did not look at her with that warmth that had made her believe she might finally be seen. And instead he stood near the door as though already preparing to flee, his signet ring turning around his finger in that gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of profound distress, and the silence stretched between them like a chasm growing wider with each heartbeat, until he finally spoke in a voice so cold and formal it might have belonged to a stranger, saying that he had come to inform her that he could not in good conscience continue their acquaintance, that upon reflection he had determined they would not suit, that he wished her well in her future endeavours, and each word fell like a stone dropped into the still waters of Eleanor's heart, sending ripples of pain outward, until her whole chest ached with the effort of keeping her composure, and she thought of the terrace at the Harcourt ball and the moonlight on the roses, and the way he had looked at her as though she were something precious and rare. And she thought of the Hyde Park drive, when he had positioned himself between her and Lady Catherine's cruel whispers, and she thought of his hand covering hers in the bookshop, and the electricity that had passed between them. And she could not reconcile any of it with this cold stranger who would not meet her eyes, and so she asked the only question that mattered, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her, asking simply whether she had imagined everything, whether the connection she had felt had been nothing more than a spinster's desperate fantasy. And Frederick's jaw tightened, and his hand stilled on his ring, and for one moment she saw something crack in his icy facade, something that looked like anguish or longing or regret. But he mastered it quickly, and said only that he was sorry for any misunderstanding, and that he hoped she would find happiness. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded to Eleanor like the ending of a story she had only just begun to believe might be hers, and she sat perfectly still in the harsh morning light, the Shakespeare sonnets gleaming on the table beside her, and she did not weep, not yet, because she had spent 26 years learning to survive disappointment, and she would not crumble now, not where anyone might see, not when there was still tonight's Greville ball to endure, and a family depending on her strength. The tears came only when Eleanor had climbed the stairs to her small bedroom at the back of the house and closed the door and pressed her back against the solid wood as though she could hold out the world that had just collapsed around her. And then they fell silently down her cheeks as she slid to the floor and wrapped her arms around her knees and allowed herself for just a few minutes to feel the full weight of the devastation she had been holding at bay since Frederick's cold words had shattered every fragile hope she had dared to nurture over the past 14 days, and she thought of all the warnings she had given herself at the beginning, all the times she had reminded herself that men like the Duke of Thornbury did not truly see women like her, that any attention he paid was surely temporary or mistaken, or part of some game she did not understand. And yet she had allowed herself to believe anyway, because the way he looked at her had felt so real, because their conversations had crackled with an energy she had never experienced, because when he bought her the Shakespeare sonnets, his hand had trembled slightly, as though he too felt the magnitude of what was building between them, and now she was left with nothing but the echo of his voice saying they would not suit, and the memory of his eyes that could not meet hers as he delivered the blow, and she wept for perhaps 10 minutes before she heard the front door open below and Harriet's voice calling her name with an urgency that suggested news travelled fast in Mayfair. And Eleanor forced herself to stand and wipe her face and straighten her grey dress before Harriet burst through the bedroom door without knocking, her lavender perfume preceding her and her face flushed with a mixture of fury and concern as she crossed immediately to Eleanor, and took both her hands and said she had heard from her footman, who had heard from the Ashworth cook, who had heard from Lydia, that the Duke had called and left Eleanor in distress. And Eleanor tried to say it was nothing, but her voice cracked on the word, and Harriet pulled her into an embrace and held her, while a fresh wave of grief washed through her, and when it subsided, Harriet led her to sit on the edge of the narrow bed, and held her hands, and said firmly that Eleanor would not let this destroy her, that whatever had happened, she was still the most remarkable woman Harriet had ever known. And Eleanor shook her head and said it did not matter how remarkable she might be when she was also plain and poor and 26 years old, and had just been publicly courted and privately discarded by the most eligible man in England. And Harriet's eyes flashed with protective anger as she said that tonight was the Greville ball, and Eleanor would attend with her head held high. And Eleanor said she could not possibly face society tonight of all nights. And Harriet gripped her hands tighter and said that hiding would only give the gossips power, that Eleanor must show them all that she was unbroken, that her dignity was worth more than any duke's fickle heart. And somewhere beneath the ashes of her hopes, Eleanor felt a small spark of defiance kindle into flame. The afternoon light had softened by the time Harriet finished her work, having sent for Eleanor's green velvet gown to be pressed, and having dispatched her own maid to assist with Eleanor's hair. And now the two women sat together in Eleanor's small bedroom as the clock on the mantel ticked toward the hour when they must begin preparing for the Greville ball, and Eleanor felt hollowed out like a shell that had been scoured clean by the tide, empty of everything except a strange calm that had settled over her once she had decided to follow Harriet's counsel and attend the ball after all, not because she wished to go, but because she refused to give Lady Catherine Greville and all the other gossips the satisfaction of seeing her hide. And Harriet was speaking of strategy now, explaining that Eleanor must enter the ballroom as though nothing had happened, must smile and dance, and show all of London that she was not destroyed by the Duke's abandonment. And Eleanor listened with half her attention, while the other half wandered to the Shakespeare sonnets still sitting on the table in the drawing-room below, the book she could not bear to look at, but could not bear to put away. And she wondered if Frederick had thought of her at all in the hours since he had walked out of her life, whether he had felt even a moment of regret as his carriage carried him away, or whether he had already forgotten the woman he had courted for 14 days and discarded like a glove that no longer fit. And Harriet must have seen something in her expression, because she took Eleanor's hands again and said that grief was permitted, but despair was not, that Eleanor had survived 26 years of being overlooked and undervalued, and she would survive this too. And Eleanor wanted to explain that this was different, that being ignored was painful, but being seen and then rejected was agony of an entirely different magnitude, that Frederick had made her believe she might finally be worthy of love, and then had snatched that belief away with a few cold words. But she did not say any of this, because saying it aloud would make it too real. And instead she straightened her spine and lifted her chin and told Harriet she was ready to prepare for the ball. And Harriet smiled with fierce pride and rang for the maid. And as the evening light began to slant golden through the window, Eleanor allowed herself to be dressed and coiffed and adorned with her grandmother's pearl earrings, transforming from a woman who had been weeping on the floor into something that looked almost like a woman who had never known heartbreak. And when she looked in the small mirror above her dresser, she saw someone she barely recognized, someone whose eyes held shadows, but whose posture spoke of dignity, unbroken. And she thought that perhaps this was what it meant to be strong, not the absence of pain, but the refusal to let pain have the final word. And somewhere in the distance she heard carriages beginning to roll toward Greville House, where the ball would soon begin, where Frederick would surely be in attendance, where Eleanor Ashworth would walk through the doors with her head held high and her heart in ruins and her pride the only armor she had left. The carriage ride to Greville House felt interminable. the clatter of hooves on cobblestones marking each moment that brought Eleanor closer to the confrontation she dreaded. And she sat beside Harriet in the enclosed darkness of the carriage, with her hands folded in her lap, and her heart beating a steady rhythm of dread and defiance that seemed to pulse through her entire body, and Harriet spoke in low, reassuring tones about the evening ahead. But Eleanor heard only fragments through the fog of her own thoughts, words like courage and dignity and triumph floating past her like leaves on a stream. And when the carriage finally slowed and joined the queue of vehicles waiting to deposit their passengers at the grand entrance of Greville House, Eleanor felt her chest tighten with something that might have been panic if she had allowed herself to name it, but instead she breathed deeply and smoothed the green velvet of her gown and touched the small pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, and reminded herself that she had survived worse than this, that she had survived years of being invisible and overlooked and dismissed. And if she could survive that, she could certainly survive one evening of being the subject of whispered speculation. And then the carriage door opened, and the footman extended his hand, and Eleanor stepped out into the cool April evening, where torchlight flickered against the facade of Greville House, and the sound of music drifted from the open windows above. And she had taken perhaps 3 steps toward the entrance, when she heard a familiar voice call her name, and turned to see Lord Victor Montague approaching from another carriage, his dark evening clothes immaculate and his smile gleaming in the torchlight, and he bowed with practiced elegance and said he had hoped to see her this evening, that he had heard the most distressing rumour about a certain duke's unfortunate lapse in judgment, and Eleanor felt Harriet stiffen beside her. But before her friend could intervene, Montague had offered his arm and said that a woman of Eleanor's quality should not enter such a gathering unescorted, that he would be honoured to accompany her. And Eleanor knew she should refuse, knew that accepting would send a message to society and to Frederick that she was aligning herself with his enemy. But in that moment she thought of Frederick's cold words that morning, and the way he had not been able to meet her eyes, and the 14 days of hope he had cultivated only to crush, and something reckless and wounded rose up in her chest, and she found herself placing her gloved hand on Montague's offered arm and allowing him to lead her toward the blazing entrance of Greville House, while Harriet hurried behind them, whispering urgent warnings that Eleanor chose not to hear, and as they climbed the stairs and passed through the great doors into the crowded foyer, where hundreds of candles cast their golden light over silks and satins and jewels, Eleanor felt the weight of every gaze that turned toward her, felt the ripple of shock that moved through the assembled guests as they recognized the woman on Lord Montague's arm. And somewhere in the glittering crowd ahead, she knew Frederick was watching too. The ballroom of Greville House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, and as Eleanor entered on Lord Montague's arm, she felt the collective attention of London society turn toward her like flowers following the sun, except these gazes held no warmth, only the sharp glitter of curiosity and judgment, and she could hear the whispers beginning already, could see the fans rising to shield moving lips as matrons leaned toward one another to exchange the delicious scandal of what they were witnessing. And beside her, Montague walked with the easy confidence of a man who knew exactly what effect their entrance was having, his hand pressing hers against his arm in a gesture that might have seemed protective, but felt instead like possession, and Eleanor's heart was pounding so fiercely she was certain it must be visible through the green velvet of her bodice, but she kept her chin lifted and her expression serene as they moved through the parting crowd toward the center of the ballroom where the dancing was about to begin. And then she saw him, standing near the far wall with Lord Pembroke at his side, and Frederick's face when he recognized her on Montague's arm was something she knew she would never forget. A flash of shock, followed by something that looked almost like pain before his expression shuttered into the cold mask she had seen that morning when he had told her he could not continue their acquaintance. And for one terrible moment, their eyes met across the glittering expanse of the ballroom, and Eleanor felt everything she had tried to suppress come rushing back. The hope and the joy and the devastating loss of it all. But she forced herself to look away, to turn her attention to Montague, who was saying something about the music and the refreshments. And when the orchestra struck up a waltz, Montague asked if she would honour him with the dance, and Eleanor heard herself accepting before she could think better of it. And then she was in his arms on the dance floor, with all of London watching, and Frederick watching, and even Lady Catherine Greville watching with an expression of gleeful malice from her position near the orchestra. And as Montague guided her through the steps with practised ease, he spoke in low tones that only she could hear, telling her she was magnificent, that she was showing everyone, including that cold-hearted Duke, exactly what he had thrown away. And Eleanor wanted to pull away from his too familiar grip and his too smooth words, but she was trapped now by her own reckless decision, trapped in the center of the ballroom in the arms of Frederick's enemy, while the man she had allowed herself to love stood frozen at the edge of the crowd. And she thought she had never felt more alone than she did in that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people and yet utterly isolated, dancing with a man she did not trust, while the man she had trusted had broken something inside her that she was not certain could ever be repaired. And the music played on and the candles blazed, and Eleanor Ashworth danced her waltz of defiance and desperation, while her heart shattered into ever smaller pieces with every step. The waltz ended, and Eleanor stepped back from Lord Montague's arms, with relief flooding through her, even as she kept her expression pleasantly neutral, and he was guiding her toward the edge of the ballroom with his hand at the small of her back, in a gesture that felt far too familiar when she saw Frederick moving through the crowd toward them with a look on his face that made her breath catch in her throat. And Montague must have seen him too, because his grip tightened almost imperceptibly, and his smile took on a sharper edge as he said loudly enough for those nearby to hear that Miss Ashworth had done him the great honour of promising the supper dance as well, which was a lie. Eleanor had promised no such thing, but before she could correct him, Frederick was there, standing before them with his jaw tight and his eyes blazing with something that looked like fury, but might have been something else entirely. And he said in a voice like ice that he believed Miss Ashworth had prior commitments, and Montague laughed that practised laugh of his and said he was quite certain the lady was free to make her own choices. After all, his Grace had made his position quite clear that very morning, had he not, and Eleanor watched the colour drain from Frederick's face and then flood back as the barb struck home, and she knew she should say something, should extricate herself from this confrontation that was drawing every eye in the ballroom, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat as the two men faced each other with years of enmity crackling between them like lightning before a storm. And then Frederick turned to her, and his expression shifted into something almost pleading as he said her name. Just her name, Miss Ashworth, in a tone she had never heard from him before, raw and unguarded and desperate. And she felt her resolve waver, felt the anger she had been clutching like armor begin to crack, and Montague must have sensed it because he stepped closer and said, perhaps Miss Ashworth would prefer to continue their conversation in the garden where it was cooler, and Frederick's hands clenched at his sides, and he said that Miss Ashworth would prefer nothing of the sort, and Eleanor finally found her voice and said that she would prefer if both gentlemen would stop speaking as though she were not standing directly before them, and her words fell into a pool of silence that rippled outward as those nearby registered what she had said, and Montague's smile faltered for just a moment, while Frederick looked at her with something like wonder mixed with his distress, and Eleanor lifted her chin and said she was quite capable of deciding for herself where she wished to be, and with whom she wished to speak, and at this particular moment she wished for neither of their company. And she turned and walked away from them both with her heart hammering and her knees trembling beneath the green velvet of her gown, leaving Frederick and his enemy standing together in stunned silence as the whispers rose around them like a tide. Eleanor found refuge in the ladies' retiring room, where she pressed her back against the cool wall and tried to steady her breathing while her hands trembled against the green velvet of her skirts, and she could hear the muffled sounds of the ball continuing beyond the door, the music and the laughter and the endless chatter of people who had just witnessed her humiliation and her small act of defiance. And she wondered what they were saying about her now, whether Lady Catherine was holding court with her circle of gossips, and declaring that the Ashworth spinster had finally revealed her true nature as a woman of no breeding and less sense. And she pressed her palms flat against her eyes to stop the tears that threatened to spill because she would not cry. She would not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her weep. Not Frederick, who had broken her heart that morning and looked at her tonight as though she had wounded him. Not Montague, who had used her as a weapon in whatever game he was playing with the Duke. Not any of the hundreds of people in that ballroom who had watched her walk in on one man's arm and walk away from two men standing speechless in her wake. And she took a shuddering breath and lowered her hands and looked at herself in the gilt-framed mirror on the wall, seeing a woman she almost did not recognize, a woman in a deep green gown with gold threading that caught the candlelight, a woman wearing her grandmother's pearl earrings and the armor of her own dignity. And she thought of what Harriet had said about showing them what Eleanor Ashworth was made of. And she straightened her spine and lifted her chin and decided that she would not hide in this room for the rest of the evening like a frightened child. She would return to the ballroom, and she would hold her head high, and she would endure whatever came next, because she had endured worse. She had endured years of being overlooked and dismissed and pitied. She had endured the slow death of her hopes season after season, and she would endure this too. And when the door opened and Harriet slipped inside with concern written across her lovely face, Eleanor managed a smile that felt brittle but real, and Harriet crossed the room and took her hands and said only that Eleanor had been magnificent out there, absolutely magnificent. And Eleanor laughed a sound that was perilously close to a sob and said she had been reckless and foolish and had probably ruined whatever remained of her reputation. And Harriet squeezed her fingers and said that reputation was a cage built by small-minded people, and Eleanor had just rattled the bars. And besides, Harriet continued with a gleam in her eye, the look on Frederick Ravenscroft's face when Eleanor walked away from him was worth any amount of scandal, because that was not the face of a man who did not care. That was the face of a man who had just realized he had made a terrible mistake and had no idea how to fix it. And Eleanor wanted to believe her. Wanted desperately to believe that there was something salvageable from the wreckage of this evening, but she was so tired of hoping for things that would never be hers, and she told Harriet she simply wanted to survive the rest of this ball and go home. Harriet linked her arm through Eleanor's and guided her back toward the ballroom door with gentle determination, and Eleanor allowed herself to be led because she had no strength left to resist. And as they emerged into the glittering chaos of the ball, she saw immediately that the confrontation between Frederick and Montague had not ended with her departure, but had instead intensified, the two men standing near the tall windows with Lord Pembroke between them, clearly trying to prevent something terrible from happening, while the guests watched with the hungry fascination that society reserved for potential scandals. And Eleanor wanted to turn away. Wanted to find some quiet corner where she could wait out the remaining hours until she could escape to the sanctuary of her bed. But Harriet's grip on her arm tightened, and she whispered that Eleanor needed to see this, needed to understand what was happening. And so Eleanor watched as Frederick said something to Montague that made the Earl's practiced smile finally slip into something ugly and real. And Montague responded with words she could not hear, but could imagine from the way Frederick's face went pale, and then dark with fury. And then Pembroke was physically stepping between them and speaking rapidly while other gentlemen moved closer as though preparing to intervene. And Eleanor realized with a sick lurch of her stomach that this was about her, that she had become the newest battleground in whatever war existed between these two men. And she hated it. Hated being reduced to a pawn in their ancient rivalry, hated that her heartbreak had become entertainment for the assembled aristocracy, and she was about to turn away regardless of what Harriet wanted her to see, when Frederick's eyes found hers across the crowded room, and everything else seemed to fall away as they looked at each other, and she saw in his face something that made her breath catch, a desperate, anguished longing that he had never allowed her to see before, not even in their most intimate conversations on moonlit terraces or in quiet bookshops while rain streamed down the windows, and she understood suddenly that whatever had driven him to reject her that morning had not been indifference or cruelty, but something else entirely, something that looked very much like fear. And Montague must have noticed the direction of Frederick's gaze, because he turned to look at Eleanor as well, and his expression shifted into something calculating and possessive that made her skin crawl. and he began to move toward her through the crowd with clear intent, while Frederick tried to follow, but was blocked by Pembroke, who was still speaking urgently to him, and Eleanor stood frozen as Montague approached with that smile back in place, that charming, practiced smile that had never reached his eyes, and he stopped before her and said that he believed she had promised him the supper dance, and he always collected on promises. And Eleanor looked past him to where Frederick stood watching with his hands clenched at his sides and his face a mask of barely controlled emotion, and she made her decision in that moment, made it knowing it might be the most foolish thing she had ever done, and she said clearly and calmly that she had promised Lord Montague nothing, and she rather thought she would sit out the supper dance entirely, and the words fell into a sudden hush as those nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Montague's face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession, surprise and then anger, and then that smooth, practiced charm sliding back into place, like a mask he had worn so often it fit him perfectly, and he laughed softly and said that Miss Ashworth was clearly overwrought from the excitement of the evening, and perhaps she should rest before making declarations she might regret, and Eleanor felt Harriet's hand tighten on her arm in warning or support she could not tell which, but she held Montague's gaze without flinching, and said that she was not overwrought, and she was not making declarations. She was simply stating a fact. She had promised him nothing, and she owed him nothing, and she would thank him to remember that she was not a chess piece to be moved about the board at his convenience. And the words came out steadier than she felt, came out with a quiet dignity that surprised her, because inside she was trembling with exhaustion and heartbreak, and the strange exhilaration of finally saying exactly what she meant without caring about the consequences. And Montague's eyes went cold and flat, and for just a moment she saw the man behind the charm, the calculating predator who had used her to wound Frederick, and would discard her without a second thought now that she had served her purpose. And he leaned closer and murmured, so only she could hear that she should be careful, because women who forgot their place in society often found that society had no place for them at all. And then he straightened and smiled that empty smile and bowed with exaggerated courtesy and walked away into the crowd, and Eleanor released a breath she had not realized she was holding. And Harriet whispered that Eleanor was the bravest woman she had ever known and also possibly the most reckless, and Eleanor laughed shakily and said she rather thought those were the same thing. And then she looked across the ballroom to where Frederick still stood by the windows, and found him watching her with an expression she could not decipher, something raw and wondering and almost desperate. And she thought about walking toward him, thought about crossing that glittering expanse of floor and demanding to know why he had rejected her that morning, if he was going to look at her like that now. But she was so tired and so hurt, and she had already spent every ounce of courage she possessed on standing up to Montague, and so instead she turned away and let Harriet lead her toward a quiet alcove where they could sit and breathe and pretend that the rest of the room was not whispering about the spinster who had arrived on one man's arm and publicly refused another while a duke looked on, and she did not see Frederick take a step toward her and then stop, did not see Pembroke appear at his side and speak urgently into his ear, did not see the way Frederick's hands clenched at his sides as he watched her disappear into the crowd. But Harriet saw everything, and she tucked that knowledge away for later because Eleanor was not ready to hear it yet, was not ready to believe that the man who had broken her heart that morning might be breaking his own heart right now, watching her walk away from him. And so Harriet simply sat beside her friend and held her hand and waited for the night to end. The night stretched interminably after that, each minute dragging like an hour as Eleanor sat in the alcove with Harriet beside her and watched the ball continue around them with all its glittering indifference, couples dancing and laughing and flirting as though nothing of significance had occurred, as though a woman's heart had not been broken and mended and broken again, all within the span of a single evening. And Eleanor found herself studying the dancers with a strange detachment, cataloguing the colors of their gowns and the patterns of their movements the way she might study specimens in a naturalist's collection, Anything to avoid thinking about Frederick's face when he had looked at her across the room. Anything to avoid examining too closely what she had seen there and what it might mean. And Harriet seemed to understand her need for silence, because she did not press Eleanor to talk, did not offer platitudes or advice, simply sat beside her with her hand warm and steady over Eleanor's cold fingers, and occasionally she would murmur some observation about the other guests, gentle mockery of Lady Catherine's increasingly elaborate attempts to position her daughters near eligible gentlemen, or quiet appreciation for a particularly skilled musician, and Eleanor was grateful for these small anchors to the present moment, because without them she thought she might drift away entirely into the treacherous waters of memory and speculation, and she did not allow herself to look toward the windows where she had last seen Frederick standing with Pembroke, did not allow herself to search the crowd for his dark head above the others, did not allow herself to wonder where he was now, and whether he was thinking of her, because that way lay madness, and she had already given him too much of herself to give him her sanity as well, and so she sat and watched and waited for the interminable evening to end, and when at last the orchestra began the final set, and the guests began to drift toward the doors in search of their carriages and their beds, Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly wound spring of tension beginning finally to uncoil, and Harriet rose and offered her hand and said that they should find Mrs. Ashworth and Lydia before the crush became unbearable, and Eleanor nodded and stood and smoothed her green velvet gown that had seen so much drama that evening, the gown she had worn with such complicated feelings that morning when Montague had offered his arm, the gown Frederick had watched her wear as she danced with his enemy, and she thought she might never be able to wear it again without remembering this night. And as they made their way through the thinning crowd, she kept her eyes forward and her chin high and her face composed into an expression of mild pleasantness that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath, and if anyone had asked her in that moment whether she regretted coming to the ball on Montague's arm, whether she regretted standing up to him before the assembled gossips, whether she regretted any of the choices she had made that evening, she would have said no. She would have said that she had done what she needed to do to survive. She would have said that sometimes dignity was all a woman had left when everything else had been stripped away, and she would have meant every word, even as her heart ached with the memory of Frederick's eyes finding hers across the crowded ballroom and the desperate longing she had seen there. The carriage ride home was silent except for the clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the distant sounds of London still awake in the small hours, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on nothing, while Harriet sat beside her, and Mrs. Ashworth dozed fitfully in the corner, and Lydia chattered in whispers about the gentleman who had danced with her, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded around her elder sister. And when at last they reached the Ashworth townhouse, on the unfashionable edge of Mayfair, Eleanor climbed down from the carriage with careful, deliberate movements, as though she were made of glass and might shatter if she moved too quickly, and Harriet squeezed her hand and whispered that she would call first thing in the morning, and Eleanor nodded without really hearing her, and walked up the steps to the door that the sleepy footman held open, and climbed the stairs to her small bedroom at the back of the house where the sounds of the street were muffled, and the moonlight fell in silver rectangles across the worn carpet, and only when she had closed the door behind her and stood alone in the darkness did she allow herself to feel what she had been holding at bay all evening, and it came over her like a wave, like a storm, like something vast and terrible that she could not control, and she pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle the sound that escaped her because she would not wake the house, would not let anyone hear her breaking, and she sank down onto the edge of her bed, still wearing her green velvet gown and her grandmother's pearl earrings, and she thought about Frederick's face when he had watched her walk away, thought about the raw, desperate longing she had seen there, thought about Montague's cold eyes when she had refused to be his pawn, thought about all the whispers and stares and the way Lady Catherine had laughed when Eleanor arrived on the arm of the Duke's enemy, and she wondered how she would face tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that, in a society that would never let her forget this night. And then she thought about what Harriet had said, that she was the bravest woman Harriet knew, and she laughed softly in the darkness because she did not feel brave. She felt exhausted and heartbroken and alone. But she also felt something else underneath all of that, something small and stubborn and fierce that refused to be extinguished. And she realized that it was her sense of self, her dignity, the core of who she was that no one could take from her no matter how they tried. And she thought about how she had stood up to Montague and said exactly what she meant without caring about the consequences. And she thought about how Frederick had watched her do it. And she wondered if perhaps that was what bravery actually was, not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. And with that thought, she finally reached up and began to remove her grandmother's pearl earrings, setting them carefully on the small table beside her bed, where the Shakespeare sonnets lay waiting. The book Frederick had given her in the bookshop that rainy afternoon, when everything had seemed possible, and she did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew that she would face it the same way she had faced tonight, with her chin high and her heart battered but unbroken. She slept fitfully, and woke to pale morning light filtering through the thin curtains of her bedroom window, and for a moment she did not remember. For a moment she was simply Eleanor Ashworth waking to another ordinary day, and then memory crashed over her like cold water, and she closed her eyes against it, against the weight of everything that had happened, the rejection, and the ball, and Montague's cold smile, and Frederick's desperate eyes across the crowded room, and she lay very still and listened to the sounds of the house stirring around her, the distant clatter of servants in the kitchen below, the creak of floorboards as someone walked past her door, and she thought about what she would have to face today, the whispers and the stares, and the endless dissection of last night's events in every drawing-room in London. And she thought about her mother's questions, and Lydia's curious glances, and the way Lady Catherine would be holding court even now, spinning the tale of Eleanor Ashworth's humiliation into entertainment for the bored and the cruel. And she wanted to stay in this bed forever, wanted to pull the covers over her head and disappear. But she knew she could not, knew that hiding would only confirm what everyone already believed about her, that she was broken, defeated, destroyed by the Duke's rejection. And so she forced herself to rise, forced herself to wash her face with water from the basin and brush her hair and put on her simple grey morning dress, the same dress she had worn yesterday when Frederick came to end everything. And she looked at herself in the small mirror above her dressing table and saw a woman who looked tired and pale, but who was still standing, still breathing, still herself despite everything. And she thought that perhaps that was enough for now. Perhaps survival was its own kind of victory. And when she descended the stairs to the breakfast room, she found her mother already there, her face pinched with anxiety. And something else, something that looked almost like anger. And Mrs. Ashworth looked up when Eleanor entered and said that she had heard, that the whole of London had heard, that Lady Catherine had sent round a note first thing this morning detailing every moment of Eleanor's disgrace. And Eleanor sat down and poured herself tea with steady hands, and said that she imagined Lady Catherine had enjoyed writing that note very much. And Mrs. Ashworth stared at her as though she had grown a second head, and asked how she could be so calm, how she could sit there drinking tea as though nothing had happened, when her reputation was in ruins and her prospects utterly destroyed. And Eleanor looked at her mother and felt something shift inside her, some final letting go of the desperate need for approval that had governed her actions for so long. And she said quietly that her reputation had never been particularly sterling to begin with, that she had always been the plain one, the overlooked one, the spinster sister who existed only to chaperone Lydia, and that at least now people would remember her name. And Mrs. Ashworth opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak there was a knock at the front door, sharp and insistent, and they both fell silent, listening as the footman went to answer it, and Eleanor's heart began to pound, because she did not know who would call so early, did not know whether to hope or to fear. The footman's voice drifted up from the entrance hall, and then there were footsteps on the stairs, quick and light, and Eleanor felt herself relax slightly because she recognized that tread. And a moment later Harriet swept into the breakfast room still wearing her lavender pelisse and her bonnet slightly askew as though she had dressed in haste. And she took one look at Eleanor sitting there in her grey dress with her cup of tea and her mother's horrified expression, And she crossed the room and gathered Eleanor into her arms without a word, and Eleanor let herself be held for just a moment, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender, before she pulled back and said that she was quite all right, that there was no need for such dramatics. And Harriet looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes, and said that she had heard what happened at the ball, that all of London had heard, that Lady Catherine had been holding court since dawn, spinning the most vicious version of events imaginable, and Mrs. Ashworth made a small, distressed sound, and said that they were ruined, utterly ruined, that no one would receive them now, that Lydia's prospects were destroyed, along with Eleanor's reputation, and Harriet turned to Mrs. Ashworth with an expression that Eleanor had never seen before, steel beneath the softness, and said that Mrs. Ashworth was being ridiculous, that Eleanor had done nothing wrong, that if anything she had conducted herself with more dignity than anyone else in that ballroom. And Mrs. Ashworth opened her mouth to protest, but Harriet continued, saying that she had already spoken to several of her acquaintances this morning, and that the story being told was not the one Lady Catherine preferred, that there were those who had seen Montague's machinations for what they were, who had noticed the way he had manipulated Eleanor into attending on his arm, who had watched Frederick watch her across the room with something that looked very much like heartbreak. And Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at the thought of Frederick watching her, at the thought of him feeling anything at all after the cold way he had dismissed her. And she said quietly that it did not matter what Frederick felt, that he had made his choice, that she would not waste any more of her heart on a man who could not decide what he wanted. And Harriet looked at her for a long moment, and then nodded slowly, and said that she was right, that Frederick had behaved abominably regardless of his reasons, but that Eleanor should know the truth of how he had looked at her, should know that whatever he had said that morning in this very room had been a lie he told himself as much as her. And Eleanor thought about that, thought about Frederick's face when he said he could not continue, the way his voice had caught, the way he could not meet her eyes. And she wondered if Harriet was right, if all of it had been fear rather than indifference. But then she thought about the fact that it did not matter, that fear or indifference, the result was the same, that she had been rejected and humiliated and made to walk into a ballroom on the arm of his enemy while all of London watched and whispered. And she set down her teacup and looked at her friend and said that she appreciated Harriet's loyalty more than she could say, but that she needed to focus now on what came next, on how to survive the wreckage of her reputation, on how to protect Lydia from the worst of the gossip, and she did not have time to wonder about the state of the Duke of Thornbury's heart. Harriet was quiet for a moment, and Eleanor could see her friend thinking, calculating, that sharp mind working through possibilities and strategies. And then Harriet nodded slowly, and said that Eleanor was right to think practically. That sentiment could wait, but survival required immediate action, and she sat down at the breakfast table and poured herself a cup of tea as though this were any ordinary morning call, as though Eleanor's world had not just collapsed around her ears, and she said that she had a plan, or the beginning of one, and that Eleanor should listen carefully before dismissing it, and Eleanor felt something like gratitude wash through her, because this was what she needed, not pity or hand-wringing, but practical assistance, a friend who would help her navigate the wreckage rather than simply mourning it with her. And Harriet said that the key was to control the narrative, that Lady Catherine had fired the first shot, but she did not have to win the war, that there were others in society who had no love for the Grevilles, and who might be persuaded to take Eleanor's side, if the story were framed correctly. And Eleanor asked what story there was to tell. She had attended a ball on the arm of a man who was not her suitor. There was nothing to frame. And Harriet smiled that knowing smile, and said that the story was not about what Eleanor had done, but about what had been done to her, that she had been rejected without cause by a duke who could not make up his mind, pursued by a scheming earl who saw her as a weapon against his enemy, and that she had conducted herself with perfect dignity throughout, while everyone around her behaved abominably, and when the story was told that way, Eleanor became not a fallen woman, but a victim of powerful men's games, and sympathy was a powerful currency in the marriage mart, even if Eleanor herself had no interest in spending it, and Mrs. Ashworth, who had been listening with growing hope, said that Harriet was brilliant, that this might actually work, that perhaps Lydia's season was not entirely ruined after all, and Eleanor felt a flash of something bitter at that, at the way her mother's concern circled always back to Lydia. But she pushed it down because it did not matter, because she had known for years where she stood in her mother's heart, and Harriet caught her eye, and gave her a look of such understanding that Eleanor had to turn away from it, and then Harriet said there was more, that she had also heard something this morning that Eleanor should know, that Frederick had been seen leaving his townhouse at dawn looking like death itself, that he had gone to his club and drunk himself into a stupor and had to be carried home by Lord Pembroke. And Eleanor said that she did not care what the Duke did or how he felt, that his regrets, if he had any, were his own problem. But even as she said it, she felt something twist in her chest, some stubborn ember of feeling that refused to be extinguished, and she hated herself for it, hated that she could still care about a man who had hurt her so badly. And Harriet watched her with knowing eyes and said nothing more about Frederick, only squeezed her hand and began to outline the next steps of her campaign to salvage Eleanor's reputation. The morning wore on, and Harriet's plan began to take shape, letters written and dispatched to carefully chosen allies, invitations accepted and declined, according to a strategy Eleanor only half understood. And through it all, Eleanor moved like a woman in a dream, performing the motions of normalcy while something inside her remained frozen and still. And by noon, Harriet had gone to pay calls and spread the preferred version of events, while Eleanor sat in the drawing-room with her embroidery untouched in her lap and stared at the wall where Frederick had stood that morning when he told her he could not continue. And she thought about the way his voice had sounded, tight and strange, as though the words were being forced through a throat that did not want to speak them. And she thought about the way his hands had clenched at his sides, and the way he had looked at her just once, just for a moment, before he turned away, and she wondered if Harriet was right that it had been fear rather than indifference. But then she reminded herself that it did not matter, because fear or indifference, the result was the same. She was alone and humiliated and facing a ballroom full of people who would be watching to see if she crumbled. And she would not crumble. She would not give Lady Catherine or Montague or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her break. And so she picked up her embroidery and forced her fingers to move, even though every stitch felt like a small act of war against the despair threatening to swallow her. And her mother came in several times to wring her hands and lament their ruined prospects until Eleanor finally said in a voice she barely recognized as her own that if Mrs. Ashworth could not say something helpful, she should perhaps say nothing at all. And her mother had stared at her with shocked, wounded eyes and retreated, and Eleanor felt a moment of guilt, followed by a fierce satisfaction because she was so tired of being the one who comforted everyone else, so tired of putting her own pain aside to manage her mother's anxieties and her sister's jealousies and her family's expectations. And just once, she wanted someone to worry about her without immediately turning the conversation to how her misfortune affected them. And she thought of Harriet, and felt grateful because Harriet had never once mentioned Lydia's prospects or the family's reputation. Harriet had looked at Eleanor and seen Eleanor and asked what Eleanor needed, and that simple kindness felt like water in a desert. And Eleanor bent her head over her embroidery and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of her grief, the loss not just of Frederick, but of the hope she had allowed herself to feel, the brief, bright dream of being seen and wanted and chosen. And then she drew a breath and pushed the grief down and focused on the needle, her, moving through fabric because there would be time for grief later, after she had survived the ball, after she had proven to everyone, including herself, that she was more than a woman who had been rejected by a duke. And the afternoon light shifted and lengthened, and somewhere across London, Frederick was drinking himself into oblivion. But Eleanor did not know that yet, would not learn of it until later, and even if she had known, she told herself it would not have changed anything, because actions mattered more than feelings, and his actions had been clear enough.